Nobody had predicted this combination would work. Not the producers who had booked it, not the critics who would later write about it, not the audience who would watch the broadcast on a Tuesday night in America and try to process what they were seeing. Not, if they were being entirely honest, either of the parties involved. The booking existed on paper before it existed in reality, and on paper, it made the kind of sense that only makes sense in a television producer's office. The sense of two large names in the same time slot, the arithmetic of attention without the arithmetic of actual compatibility. The compatibility was not apparent from the outside. It emerged from the inside over the course of a single day in ways that neither side had been prepared to predict, and that both sides, in their different ways, were not entirely prepared to admit. Crosby, Stills and Nash had spent the first months of their existence as a group being understood as the sound of a specific cultural moment. The Woodstock moment. The counterculture moment. The moment when the idea of the acoustic guitar as a political instrument had reached a kind of critical mass in American popular consciousness. Their three-part harmonies, their political content, their association with the festival circuit and the anti-war movement, and everything that went under the broadly applied heading of the 60s, all of this placed them in a category that had a clearly designated opposite. And that opposite was Tom Jones. Tom Jones was Las Vegas. Tom Jones was the sequined showroom. Tom Jones was the network television variety program, the screaming audience, the chest hair and the wide lapels, and the voice that hit the back wall of the Flamingo showroom at full force 6 nights a week. If the American popular music of 1969 was being arranged into two camps, those who were of the counterculture and those who were of the establishment, Tom Jones and Crosby, Stills and Nash were the anchoring examples of opposite poles. And yet, there they were, in the same ABC television studio, on the same stage. By the end of the day, making music together with an ease that no one watching from outside the room would have predicted, and that no one inside the room could afterward fully explain. The story of that day is not the story of a booking decision. Bookings happen on paper and are motivated by ratings arithmetic and publicist relationships and the particular logic of a broadcast calendar. The story of that day is the story of what happened after the booking, when the paper became a room and the room became music, and the music became something that neither the counterculture nor the Las Vegas showroom had designed or anticipated or could fully claim. It belonged to the day itself. It belonged to the specific hour when two worlds that had been told they were opposites discovered, by the simple method of being in the same physical space and doing the same work, that they were not. What happened arrived in stages. The first stage was the rehearsal, which began with a quality of mutual wariness that everyone in the room could feel. Two camps from different sides of the cultural divide, each assessing the other with the particular care of people who have arrived at a place not entirely sure of what to expect. The stage crew felt it. The band felt it. The floor manager felt it and added it to the list of things he was managing alongside the running order and the camera positions and the 45 minutes of broadcast time that had been organized around an assumption of cooperation that was not yet fully in evidence. Then Tom Jones began to sing. The wariness dissolved the way wariness dissolves when a voice removes the ground from under the argument that produced it. There was no argument available against what Tom Jones's voice did in that rehearsal room. It was simply too present, too specific, too unambiguously real to be filed under the category of Las Vegas showmanship. It was a voice doing what voices at their most fundamental level do, communicating something that was not available through any other means. David Crosby listened. He had been right about what he heard in the recordings. It was there in the room, and it was larger there. He listened with the expression of a man who has arrived prepared to maintain a position, and who is in the process of discovering that the position does not survive contact with the evidence. The rehearsal continued. The harmonies were attempted and then refined, and then worked through again until they were doing what harmonies do when the people producing them are paying full attention, becoming something larger than the sum of the individual voices, creating space in the music that none of the individual parts contained alone. When the cameras rolled that evening, the combination that no one had predicted would work, worked. The studio audience received it with the confusion of pleasure, the experience of being given something that did not fit their expectations, and that they enjoyed in spite of that, or because of it. The program that night was, by any standard the producers applied, a success. The studio audience that night had come expecting a variety program and received something that the variety format had been an accidental container for, rather than the cause of. They responded with the sustained quality of attention that is different from applause, less demonstrative, more internal. The response of people processing something they have not yet organized into a reaction. The floor manager, reviewing the evening, noted that the applause at the end of the joint performance was delayed by several seconds longer than was usual. He noted this as unusual. He did not note the reason for the delay, which was that the audience needed the extra seconds to return from wherever the music had taken them. But the thing that stayed, afterward, was not the broadcast. It was the rehearsal. The moment when the wariness had dissolved, the moment when the cultural categories had stopped applying, and what remained was just the music. And two sets of performers in the same room discovering that they had been wrong about each other, and that being wrong about each other was one of the better things that had happened to any of them all year. This is Tom Jones had been defying its critics' predictions since it launched in January of 1969. The show had attracted more than 20 million viewers on its first broadcast, which was the kind of number that made the argument about whether Tom Jones belonged on network television entirely academic. He was already there, and the audience had already decided they wanted him. What the critics had not predicted was the range of the guest list, which continued week after week to pull from parts of the musical world that a Las Vegas headliners program had no particular business reaching into. The booking of Crosby, Stills and Nash was the most ambitious version of this project yet attempted, the most explicit statement of the show's actual ambition, which was not to produce 45 minutes of comfortable variety entertainment, but to put the genuinely disparate elements of the musical moment in the same room and see what they did to each other. The group had just released their debut album, which had gone immediately to the center of the cultural conversation in a way that debut albums rarely do. The three voices in combination, Crosby's harmonic complexity, Stills's acoustic directness, Nash's melodic clarity, had produced something that the pop world recognized immediately as significant, and that the counterculture recognized as its own. David Crosby in 1969 was not the kind of person who appeared on variety shows without reasons. He was 27 years old, opinionated, artistically serious, and possessed of a quite specific contempt for the entertainment machinery that he understood Tom Jones to represent. He had agreed to appear on the show. His reasons for agreeing were more complicated than the booking suggested. Part of his reason was simple. The show had real reach. An audience of millions. An audience that was not already converted. But there was another reason, less easily stated. David Crosby had been paying attention to Tom Jones's voice for longer than he would have been comfortable admitting in that specific cultural moment. The voice was real. Whatever one thought of the showroom context, the voice itself was real in a way that Crosby, who had grown up around music and who could hear what was actually happening in a voice when he listened carefully, could not dismiss. Graham Nash had arrived with fewer ideological reservations than Crosby and a more straightforwardly professional understanding of what the appearance was. Stephen Stills had arrived with the guitar player's particular quality of assessment, the attention to what the arrangements were doing, the practical ear of a musician who was less interested in the cultural meaning of a performer than in the specific decisions the performer made in real time. Tom Jones, for his part, had been listening to Crosby, Stills, and Nash with the specific quality of attention he brought to voices that were doing things he had not heard before. The three-part harmony was something his own musical formation, the Welsh choral tradition, the gospel and soul records he had absorbed in his 20s, had given him a vocabulary for. He understood what they were doing harmonically in a way that someone without that background might not. He recognized it as sophisticated. He recognized it as a different application of some of the same principles he had grown up with in the chapels and the choral societies of Pontypridd, where harmony was not an aesthetic option, but a communal practice as fundamental as language. He had built the show around this kind of recognition. Not recognition in the sense of familiarity, but recognition in the deeper sense. The specific quality of hearing something and knowing, before you can articulate why, that it matters. He had heard that in the Crosby, Stills and Nash record, and he had wanted the room to contain both the recognition and the reality, to see if the thing held up when the categories fell away and only the music remained. He wanted to be in the same room with those voices and see what happened. What the episode demonstrated, for anyone who was watching it carefully, was something that the cultural divisions of 1969 worked very hard to obscure. That the music was larger than the categories it was being organized into. The Woodstock generation had built a story about authenticity that required a villain, and the Las Vegas showroom headliner was one of the convenient villains in that story. Tom Jones fit the profile. Commercial, mainstream, the opposite of the acoustic guitar circle around the campfire. The story required him to be what he was being described as. He was not what he was being described as. He was a Welsh man from a mining valley who had been given a voice of extraordinary size and directness, and who had spent his entire career following it wherever it led, without particular regard for what the industry or the cultural critics thought the destination should be. He had arrived at Las Vegas and at network television because the voice had led him there, and because the rooms were large enough to hold it. He had brought Crosby, Stills and Nash into his television studio because the voices had interested him, and because he had understood correctly that interesting voices were interesting voices, regardless of which side of the cultural argument they were standing on. David Crosby understood this by the end of the day. He did not announce his understanding. He did not publish a revision of his cultural position. He simply behaved, for the remainder of the taping, like a musician who had encountered another musician he respected, which is its own form of announcement, available to anyone in the room who was paying attention. They had come in as representatives of opposing worlds. They left as musicians who had shared a stage. The difference between those two things was the whole of the day, and the whole of the day had been enough. Some of what was discovered in that studio, about what Tom Jones's voice actually was, about what Crosby, Stills and Nash actually were, about the distance between the cultural story and the musical reality, has never been fully stated in any form that the cultural record of the period kept. The cultural record preferred its categories. The categories were tidier. The room on that particular day in Los Angeles in 1969 had been less tidy than the categories, and truer, and finally, more interesting. The music had the last word. It always does, in the end, for the people who are willing to listen to it instead of to what they expect it to say.